nanohub.org.
Online simulation and more for nanotechnology.
All right, thank you very much. And what I'd like to do today is talk about some of the work that we've been doing in our group, and that's mainly related to AI, if I may put it. And so we are working on brain-inspired computing from different levels of abstraction, going all the way from sort of like little devices that can potentially mimic the neurons and synapses, all the way up to algorithms. Now, it turns out that you guys are all from different areas. Is that correct? I mean, I am from electrical engineering, so this talk is going to be a little bit, electrical engineering centric. However, I'm not going to go into much details of the devices or circuits, but sort of give you a brief overview of the kind of things that we are doing. Okay? So, and again, feel free to stop me, ask me any questions, if you have. Most important thing is that whatever I'm going to be really presenting are really the work done by my students. And the good thing about, my job is that I go around, not just on campus, around the world also, and give talks, and all basically done by my students. So I'd like to acknowledge them, and this is what I'm going to be presenting today is also, related to the kind of things that they have done. So with that in mind, let's get started. And since you've all heard of AI and deep learning, right? And deep learning certainly has made a huge amount of progress. And you see it in the news almost every day. And if I really think about it, I mean, you hear about this news that AI beats natural intelligence, and it does. And today it's very, very difficult for a grandmaster, let's say a chess grandmaster, in fact, even a Go master, to really beat the computers. It's really going to be very, very tough. And you've heard of, back in 1997, you guys are young, probably not even born in 1997, but back in 1997, IBM Deep Blue played Kasparov. More recently, 2011, IBM Watson versus the Jeopardy masters. And again, the Jeopardy masters, they lost. And more recently, about a year and a half ago, it was Lee Sedol, the Go champion, who actually played with AlphaGo, but lost 4-1. There's a nice sort of a video and actually a movie on documentary on this. You might want to see it. It's actually quite interesting. But more importantly, in all these cases, the computers did much better. But the question, of course, is at what cost? So if I really look at the power consumption, back in 1997, the computer, that was about 15,000 watts. If I really look at the Watson, that's about 200,000 watts. And if I really go and approximate the energy consumption or the power consumption in this case, that's about 300,000 watts with, more than about 2,000, CPUs and 280 or so GPUs. But the question is, how does the brain do it? Certainly they lost, but the brain was about 20 watts or so, It's actually way less than 20 watts. So interesting thing is that if you really look at the energy efficiency gap that exists today, that's about 10 to the 4 or so. So there's a need for really coming up with methodologies and techniques where if you want to use your intelligence on handheld devices, then there's a need to really reduce that gap because you can't afford to have that much of a power consumption on your, cell phones as an example, right? And in fact, today, if you really look at the cell phones, your battery probably doesn't even last more than a few hours. So there's a tremendous need for really coming up with the right kind of architecture, the right kind of devices, and probably knowing the right kind of algorithms that the brain use. And the other side of it, and this is actually something also interesting to look at, and what about on-chip, embedded learning? That was actually on very high-performance machines. And if I really think about on-chip embedded learning on your, handheld devices, and this is an example of, for example, this Google kind of glass, where what I'm showing here is that one of the flight attendants in, I think from Virgin Atlantic or somewhere, they were wearing this to really recognize maybe the important customers, to basically give them the right kind of service, knowing that this person likes what kind of coffee and all, I might be able to actually serve you better by really recognizing you. And so that's the kind of glass that one can potentially use. Can you do that? And certainly it's possible to do that today. But the question again is, at what cost? So if I really do an analysis of it, and this is actually an analysis done by one of my colleagues from electrical engineering department, Anand Raghunathan, Professor Anand Raghunathan. What they did is they basically looked at some network architecture in this particular case, and they looked at different kinds of the processors that are available, and did an analysis of battery life considering ideal conditions. And it turns out, under ideal conditions, if you really want to have that Google Glass and be able to recognize people, and it turns out that the time to die for battery is about 25 minutes under ideal conditions. And if you consider non-ideal or in real life conditions, it's probably going to be 15 minutes or so. Okay? So obviously, you can't keep on replacing batteries every 15 minutes. That doesn't work well. So there's again a need for really coming up with the right kind of architectures and devices that can potentially give you much better, battery lifetime. And as I mentioned earlier, today's deep learning networks are certainly, doing really, really well, but there are actually certainly, several kinds of problems. So what are the problems? The kind of architecture or the algorithms that we're talking about, and Brain does it, there's a need for learning, right? And in order to learn things, for example, if our brain has to learn certain things, if I have to recognize people, I have to, see those people, learn them, learn their features, and be able to recognize folks, right? So there's a need for learning, and in order to learn, it turns out today, you require a massive amount of training data. So the question is, that training sometimes takes a lot of time. So the question is, can I learn with much less data? That's something which is very important. In general, today's deep learning techniques which are used, use supervised learning. Can I do unsupervised or semi-supervised learning? And that also turns out to be quite important. Now, there's something also interesting that if the algorithms or the architectures today that we have, if you end up, if they end up learning a particular data set, they learn, as an example, let's say cats, dogs, horses, tigers, and so on. And at the end of it, once it learns a data set, you said, hey, something, I'm going to learn something new now. I'm going to learn humans and other species, let's say. In that case, it turns out in order to learn, you have to relearn the things that you've learned before. Or in other words, you have to mix up the data sets together to be able to actually learn the two data sets together. And that's a humongous effort again. There's something called, catastrophic forgetting, and that's a problem. And we don't catastrophically forget things, right? We learn things and then we retain that information. So the question, of course, is, can I really have a learning methodology which is lifelong? Okay? And in order to do lifelong learning, there are all kinds of other interesting things one has to look at. I also mentioned something which is a huge power consumption. And so, how can I really reduce that energy consumption? And that's mainly going to be the focus today. Can I really reduce the energy consumption of some of these, devices? Another one that turns out to be also quite important, and there's a need for it. There are self-driving cars today which are coming up. They're not ready yet, right? Drones, which are self-flying drones, and you can potentially think of swarm of drones which can fly together to be able to actually do some interesting things, have collective intelligence. Turns out in order to do all those sort of things, you can't just do image recognition. You got to go beyond image recognition, speech and text recognition. Your cell phones do have some of these text and image recognition softwares which are available. Turns out you got to go much beyond that. And that should include tomorrow's cognitive systems would require a larger range of functions, not just sensory processing, but you need to be able to reason out things, right? When you see something, you reason about it and finally make a decision so that you can actually take an action. So if you want to have self-flying drones and again self-driving cars, you really need to go all the way from, understanding, let's say, what's in front of you, but to be able to reason about it and make decisions. And we humans are really good at doing that, right? So can I do that? And there's a need for doing these end-to-end kind of functionality. And, there's a lot more work to be done. And at the end of it, you also have to think about the fact that, hey, I don't have the biological neurons and synapses to do the computation. So can I really come up with devices that can mimic the neurons and synapses of the brain in some ways. And if I'm able to do that, maybe my energy consumption is going to go down. So these are all these inefficiencies that exist today. And if I now go into a little more details of it, and try to analyze where do these inefficiencies come from on these deep neural networks, and if I really look at a biological neural network, it turns out, first to start with, I don't even know the algorithms of the brain. There's been a whole lot of work which is going on in the neuroscience area, trying to understand things, but I still don't really know how things work in the brain. We probably don't even know 10% of what the brain does, right? So that's certainly a problem when we are trying to mimic some things of the brain. From whatever little that we know, the computing architecture of the brain is certainly not like a von-Neumann machine. I assume that you're all familiar with some sort of a von-Neumann machine, right? Or at least you know what a von-Neumann machine computing architecture is. There's a memory and there's a processing unit. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. And the basic idea is that you do some processing, and in order to do the processing, the data exists in the memory. So you got to go fetch the data from the memory, right? Bring it back to your processing unit. Do whatever you're supposed to do, multiplication, addition, or whatever that you need to do, and then you have to take it back and store it back into the memory again. And from whatever little that we know of the brain, the architecture of the brain is not like a von-Neumann computing machine. It turns out that in the brain, we have different synapses and neurons, and somehow the computation is certainly done in the memory itself. In some ways, the memory does the computation too, which we don't do that in the standard von-Neumann machine. So that can be certainly one, inefficiency that exists. Finally, we don't have the neurons, we don't have the synapses. The biological neurons, the biological synapses, and more importantly, we don't even have the algorithms. So if I were to really think about these artificial neural networks and going from a biological neural network to a simplified version of an artificial neural network, then let's try to see, this is basically a network that I'm really going to be looking at, which is sort of like, inspired from the brain. And the network has a basic set of nodes which are shown here, which are connected to other nodes of the circuit in some complex fashion. Okay? And each of those nodes is going to do some sort of operation based on inputs which are coming from these other nodes. So we're going to call these neurons and these connections here to be synapses in some ways. And if I were to really look at the computation which is being done by this node, which is an approximation of what the biological neural network does, then it's going to look somewhat like this. That little box that I showed has inputs coming in from other those little boxes or little other inputs, and it turns out what it really ends up doing is it has a bunch of these inputs which are coming in, which are multiplied by some weight. W1 through Wn, they are summed. You do the weighted summation of that, input multiplied by these weights, and then at the end of it, you actually do a thresholding operation, which is really nothing other than a very simple-minded operation, which is if it's below a threshold, you say, okay, it's 0. If it's above a threshold, you say 1. That's a very, very simple-minded way of doing things. In general, you may not want to do that. This kind of thresholding operation, we'll go into that a little bit later on, but that's very simple-minded operation that you can do. So the basic operation then, it's a bunch of these weighted summations that we do, or in other words, I got to do multiplication, right? I have to multiply I1 times W, and a bunch of those, sum it up, and that's the computation that I need to do, and I keep on doing these computations for each of those nodes. So what I haven't told you is that the input could be an image, right? And that's, let's say I'm trying to recognize. I haven't told you anything about W1s to Wn. Who gives you that W1 through Wn? These are the synaptic weights. Turns out, and I'm not going to go into any details of it, one can find that W1 through Wn using a procedure called training. Okay, so let's say that I have, our brain gets trained to recognize certain things. So what I'm really doing in the training process is that, hey, I'm trying to come up with these values W1 through Wn. There are different ways of doing that. Some of you, if you have heard about it, back propagation, you actually go through the network, You show an image, at the output you get something, it doesn't match. In order to match it, what you really have to do is figure out what is the loss that I've incurred at the output. Okay? And based on that loss, I backward propagate through the circuit so that I can update my weights in a way that I actually can reduce that loss. Okay? So, and there are other ways of doing things too, but that's something that people have been doing in an analog neural network, and an analog neural network which basically is sort of a little bit, different version of the simple-minded neuron and synapses that I show. This is actually a deeper learning network. You have lots of layers. Okay, there's an input that are coming in. There are lots of these layers of these neurons and synapses connected the way I showed earlier. Right? And you end up doing the same functionality, except in this particular case, in a deep neural network, there are actually, in fact, you learn some features using convolutional layers. If it doesn't make sense, don't worry about it. But the bottom line is that you actually try to extract some features out of those images and try to learn those features using a deeper network. Okay? And once you have learned those features, and learning really means that you need to understand what those weights are going to be, the W's. And there are a whole bunch of these W's, as you can imagine, right? A huge number of those W's that you have to learn, and it takes a good amount of time. So if I give you a data set of cats, dogs, horses, tigers, all animals, let's say, what you really have to do is you have to now train the network with those images, which are now going to be trained. And you have to determine what those weights are going to be so that when I have a test image, okay, which is not in the training set, a new test image that's given, which could be a cat, which could be a dog, the network is going to recognize and say at the output, hey, this is actually a cat or a dog. Okay, with very, very high probability. They may not be able to say with 100% assurance, but with 99 or 95% accuracy, say, hey, that's a cat or a dog. And in fact, we also do that. We probably are not going to be able to give you 100% accuracy in a lot of cases. All right. So in that case, it turns out that the neuron functionality that I showed or talked about earlier, which is just like a step function, which is just a very simple thresholding, below a threshold 0, above a threshold 1, that may not work really well because it has two states, right? 0 and 1. It turns out that, a better way of representing that is somewhat like, not a thresholding, these kind of perceptron-like thresholding, but in other words, you would like to have is something like a, sigmoid function. People use these kind of sigmoid function, which are not quite 0 and 1. Somewhere here in the middle, it could be, 0.5, 0.6, and so on, and it turns out that works better. Now, interestingly enough, this is, if we call this to be an analog neural network or a deep neural network, turns out that, interestingly enough, the brain doesn't do it that way. The processing that I just showed here with analog inputs turns out is not really the way brain does it. Brain, interestingly enough, actually uses spikes. People have done experiments that have actually shown that, spikes are used to represent inputs. So interestingly, there's a new area that researchers are looking at, which are called the spiking neural networks, okay, which are more bioplausible, more what the, closer to what the brain does. And again, remember that, we probably don't know a lot of things what the brain does, but at least we understand that it works with spikes. So if I were to actually use spikes, in fact, the inputs are not going to be like analog inputs that I was showing earlier, from images. Now they might actually look like input spike trains. So I have to represent my image as an example in this particular case as, a bunch of these spike trains that are going to come in. And using those spike trains, you are going to do some operations. In this particular case, a biological, neural network would have input spike trains that comes in, and there is the cell or the neuron membrane potential goes up or down depending on if there are a lot of spikes that come in or there are, there are no spikes which are available in the inputs at that time. And beyond a certain point, when it reaches a particular threshold, it actually switches. So this would be quite different from these other deep learning networks that I'm showing here. These are the spiking neural networks, which are closer to what the brain does. And you might actually ask, why am I really going to look at these kind of networks? It turns out that there are several reasons. First reason being the fact that, it is, closer to what the biology does. And then you might say, so what, right? You certainly have to be able to get something more out of it. And in fact, it turns out that if you do use spikes, there are certain interesting event-driven architectures that you can use, which basically can reduce energy consumption. And if you also look at spikes, the number of spikes, and if you have a larger network, it turns out that the energy consumption can be lower, and the learning that one can do can be unsupervised learning. It can be easily have unsupervised localized learning. Okay? So with that in mind, one can certainly look at these kind of spiking neural networks. And there are, in fact, in 2016, IBM came up with, some of you might have heard of this chip called the True North. Anybody heard of True North? No? Okay. But they had one. And more recently, actually, Intel has a chip called Loihi, which are not commercially available. But that's kind of like using this concept to do, again, different kinds of end-to-end functionality, AI functionality. All right? Now, few other things. I keep saying that, there are inefficiencies. So where are these inefficiencies coming from? If, those of you who are sort of electrical, have taken some courses in electrical engineering, some of you know of transistors. So how many of you have know of transistors or know what the transistors do? Some of you, right? They act as, in a very, very simple-minded way, they're switches. So it turns out that using those switches, you can actually make neurons and synapses. Okay, by connecting some of these transistors together, you can actually get memory functionality, which is shown here, and you can actually get the neuron functionality also. In order to do the neuron functionality, you need to have a lot more transistors. You need to do the multiplication. You need to do some of these, these addition operation and some thresholding operation. So what I really wanted to tell you is the fact that when you try to implement this in using these transistors or the CMOS, I mean, some of you might have heard of CMOS, complementary metal oxide semiconductor technology. Anybody? So if you use a CMOS technology, it turns out that you need a good number of transistors to do that functionality. However, in the brain, certainly we have one device to represent it. Here, if you really look at this will require you hundreds of transistors to do. Whereas if I'm able to come up with a device rather than a standard transistor-like device, if I were to really come up with a different kind of device, and I'm not going to bore you with the kind of device that we're looking at, but it turns out that there are magnets or magnetic devices that one can look at, as an example, and a magnet can really represent the neuron and the synaptic functionality in some interesting ways using a single device. They may not exactly be like the biological neurons, but it has interesting properties. The magnetization dynamics has some interesting properties and can potentially mimic the functionality of a neuron and a synapse using very simple-minded devices. So can I use it? And if I do, there are some interesting possibilities of getting improvement in not only area, but also the energy consumption. Few other things. I mentioned earlier that if I really look at the computing paradigm, and if I really look at the functionality, forget about, whether you understand neural networks or not. If I tell you that, hey, the basic idea in a neural network is, I'm going to do these computations. That everybody should understand, right? The computation that I'm really doing is, I have a bunch of inputs which are coming in, and I'm multiplying it by weights, which I've learned. And I haven't told you how to learn it, right? I've learned those weights, and then I actually keep on doing this kind of, weighted summation operation and thresholding operation into the next set of layers. And if I do that, this is the functionality that I would always do in a neural network. Okay? Nothing else. If I tell you that, and if I now tell you, I give you a computing architecture. And that architecture looks somewhat like this. I have memory that you should all know because you do use cell phones, right? You use other computers all the time. So you talk in terms of the memory. Yeah, there is a cache memory, right? So on my chip, there is a memory. There's cache memory that can be large. And I have to act, and what do I do in that memory? I keep storing these synaptic weights that I've learned. Okay, I stored those in my SRAM cells or my memory, and I have a processing unit. What is this processing unit going to do? Remember, I have to do multiplication, right? Remember, I have to do addition. So what do? I actually go fetch data from these SRAM cells, let's say W's, and after I fetch the W's, I go into this processing unit, I do multiplication, and then I do additions. I keep on fetching new data. Next one, I go do the multiplication, do the addition again, and after doing that, I send it back to the memory again, right? Very inefficient. That's not the way the brain does it, okay? If I were able to do this particular computation that I'm showing here in the memory itself, then I hardly need to go to my processing unit. If I could, and in fact, in some ways, brain does it, right? And that gives another level of efficiency. Not only having the right kind of neurons and synapses, but at the same time, if I were able to do all this computation in the SRAM cell itself, or in the memory itself, in the cache memory itself, right? Then this traffic is going to be less, right? It's almost like, if I'm cooking, I give this example. If I'm cooking, and if I have my, ingredients, if I have all my ingredients all the time in my refrigerator, which is let's say in the garage, I got to go to the garage, get back my things, cut it, put it back in the memory, because I don't have any more space here. I put it back in my refrigerator again and keep on doing that. My cooking is going to take a long time and it's going to be very, very inefficient. And think about that I don't have all the elements for cooking in my, simple refrigerator. If we are thinking about a large cache, which is my grocery store, if I have to really go, every time I go to the grocery store, get my stuff and do the things, and then I go back to the grocery store to keep it, if I don't have storage here, that's going to be very, very inefficient, right? So I don't want to do that. If I were able to do my computations right here, that would be ideal, but it's very difficult to do that with the current day technology. Okay? So, interestingly enough, that if I were able to do such computations in the memory itself and assume that I'm able to do that, and as I mentioned, there are devices that we've been looking at where you can do these kind of computations in the memory, these multiplications and additions directly in the memory. If I were able to do that, it turns out, and these are some of the data sets that one can look at, and these are some image recognition data sets that one can look at, and it turns out that if I compare that to, for example, a standard von-Neumann architecture where such in-memory computing is not possible, then the improvement in energy consumption is huge. About 200 to 1000x improvement in energy consumption that you can get compared to today's von-Neumann architectures and computing. Okay? And it looks a little bit different. It basically has these devices that I showed earlier, right? Which are connected in sort of an array fashion with neurons, which are shown here. They look alike in some interesting ways. I'm not going to go into details of it, but if I am able to do that, as I said earlier, the results are going to be really, really good. Certainly not like the brain. It's still going to be a lot less inefficient compared to the brain, but way better. Now, this is something which is important. Now, we are in a stage where the question that comes up is, you might say that, you're trying to mimic the brain and not even knowing how the brain does it in a lot of cases. So, what should be brain-inspired? Should I have my neurons, as I said, like the spiking neurons, like what the brain does? Or should it be like this sigmoid kind of neuron that I showed, or the perceptron-like neurons that I showed earlier? Those are simple to do, right? Should I use that? Who told me that that's the best way to do it? Because I'm not really, exactly doing what the brain does. I'm trying to mimic some functionality. And in fact, in some cases, I'm trying to actually do better than what the brain does. So what should be neuromorphic? What kind of neuron models should I use? Should it be brain-like? should I use? What kind of learning algorithm should I use? There's something called, you may or may not have heard about it, spike timing dependent plasticity. If you haven't, that's fine, but what kind of, algorithm should I use? What kind of computing principles should I use? What kind of network topology should I use? It turns out that those are all important. Should it be brain-like? Because the functionality that I'm really interested in doing is, as I mentioned, perception, reasoning, decision-making, not just simple-minded, scientific computations. For scientific computation, certainly, the von-Neumann computing is good. Okay? But not for the kind of things that we are talking about. This is somewhat very similar to, we are in a stage which is when we initially learned how to fly. It was very, very important to understand how the bird flaps its wings and flies. Very important. And people tried to understand that. And in fact, people tried that, hey, is it an efficient way of doing it? But think about it. The 747s of today. In fact, the 747s are going out of business. Maybe I should say 787, so whatever. But anyway, all these, planes, airplanes, and jumbo jets are taking off, going halfway around the world in 15 hours, 10 to 15 hours, carrying a payload of, 400 passengers. No birds can, right? So we're doing better than the birds, and we're not even flapping the wings. And if you did, if you take a flight and the flight were to flap its wings, you can be very, very sick. I can guarantee you that. So you don't want that, right? So you really need to figure out, hey, what should be, bird-like? What should be brain-like? And that is going to be quite important. Because the kind of functionality, I'm not really exactly doing what the brain does. I'm really interested in, for example, doing certain kinds of operation, having drones, self-flying drones, or for that matter, personal robotic assistants, which might actually, get you the kind of coffee or the kind of food that you want at home. You can do all kinds of interesting things, but for that, it doesn't exactly have to be what the brain does. We need efficiency. So the question is, what should be brain-like? Now, I'm not, again, going to go into any details of it, but just wanted to tell you that in our research group, and in fact, one of my graduate students, Priya, is here, and it's actually a slide that, the work that she worked on. The things that we've been looking at on one side of it, if you really look at the left side of it, we've been looking at different kinds of, recognition problems, which are really implemented in this particular case using these deep learning kind of concepts, okay? With modifications to the deep learning concept. And as I mentioned earlier, that's not quite like what the biology does. They don't have the spiking neurons. But on the other side of it, if you really look at these kind of problems that we've been looking at, these are actually more like with the spiking neural networks. And the reason why spiking turns out to be important is because we were doing self-learning in this particular case. And not only self-learning or semi-supervised learning, it turns out that, remember I talked about the fact that, the future networks, we don't want any catastrophic forgetting. We'd like to have lifelong learning. That turns out to be important when you want to do lifelong learning. It turns out when you do lifelong learning, we probably have to also forget, right? We don't have infinite memory. There's a need for us to forget. For various reasons, we'd like to forget things, right? We don't remember, bad things. We try to remember good things in life. And that's also for a different reason. But if I really want to learn things, and if I want to do lifelong learning, I might have to forget things which are not so important, right? So there's a need for not only learning to learn, but there's a need for learning to forget. So how do you make sure that your, the algorithms and the architecture that you're looking at sort of helps you in forgetting the right kind of things? So that's something that is very important and it's need to look at. So learning to learn, but along with that, there's a need for learning to forget. So, and that's quite suitable with sort of a spike-based network, which is more bioplausible. All right. So I'm going to change gear a little bit. And I kept talking about one thing, that, you need to do your computations in the memory itself, and that's going to be exciting. So I'm not going to talk much about the algorithm part of things, but hey, if I the hardware fabric that I need to implement some of these algorithms, there's some interesting requirements for that, for the hardware fabrics. So again, let's try to go back and try to look at some of the hardware fabrics which are available today and the kind of things that we are doing in our research group. All right. As I mentioned earlier, and again, I'm not going to go into too much details. Turns out if you're using a von-Neumann computing machine, you have a memory and you have a processing unit. And as I said, it's very inefficient because you have to get data from the memory, do the computation, take it back into the memory again, and a lot of traffic, and that requires a huge amount of energy consumption. More energy than the processing unit would require. Okay? And that's not normal. So if I really look at the memory energy consumption, that's about 75 to 80% of the total power consumption of these systems. And the data path, or in other words, the CPU, the processing unit power consumption, is not that much. And if you look at today's multi-cores and GPUs or accelerators, they use similar kind of concept. Certainly they can get some improvement over the standard CPUs. However, you're nowhere close to what the brain does. As I said, the energy efficiency of the brain is probably about 10 to the 3 to 10 to the 4 times better than. Now, there are things that you can do in the neuromorphic world. You can actually make different kinds of in-memory computing, different kinds of approximations, and you can potentially use the devices, as I mentioned earlier, which are kind of which can mimic the neurons and synapses. Now, what I'm going to do first is actually talk about some approximations that one can do. Now, when things don't work, in fact, people have noticed that if your, few neurons and synapses are not kind of working. Now, for a normal, for normal people, that's fine. But when people have, for example, strokes, they can forget things. Okay? But then they can be retrained into learning the same things again. And it does happen, and then things work that way. Interestingly enough, for all these class of algorithms and things like that we're talking about, they lend themselves to error resiliency. So what do I really mean by that? That I can do approximations. So what kind of approximations? In general, if anybody, have taken a course on signal processing? Digital signal processing? Do you do approximations? Do you do rounding? You do, a lot of cases you do, rounding, you do other kinds of approximations that you end up doing, right? So it turns out that, we can do that too. But we can go in fact even further than that. We may not want to even maintain a Boolean equivalence. So what is 10 plus 10? 20. Right? But do I need 10 plus 10 to be 20 to do all these computations? Probably not. So if I have a 10-year-old kid, if I were to teach him, 10 plus 10 is 20, absolutely. And I'm not going to teach him anything else at the moment. But for you guys, maybe 10 plus 10, 19 is okay. Maybe 10 plus 10, 21 is okay. Not just for the fun of it. In fact, if you really look at the math of it, it's actually quite complicated and interesting. Okay? If I don't maintain my Boolean equivalence, and I can still get my answer, then there's no need to maintain that Boolean equivalence. In other words, if I can do my computation with 10 plus 10 to be 19 or 18 or 17, and if I don't have my adders to be accurate, my hardware is different now, right? It's an approximate hardware. It is not doing the exact addition that I want to do. And why would I do that? Certainly for the fun of it, it's good, right? But what else? If I can make my circuits very simple, and you don't have to understand circuits, okay? Making those approximations, if I can make my hardware circuits really, really simple, right? Maybe I should do that. And it turns out if I do that, and I retrain my neural networks, my training now, remember I kept talking about earlier about training, and I needed to find out W1s through Wn, right? It was important, and during the training process, right, I assumed that all my hardwares were exact, right? 10 plus 10 was 20. But hey, if I give you an interesting hardware, a new hardware, which is very, very simple, right? But it doesn't exactly give you the results, exact results of addition that you learned in your high school, right? If it doesn't give you that, but it's very simple hardware. The circuits are very simple. I said, okay, let me try it out. But I train my networks with those approximate hardware. And it turns out that it does really well. It still does well. It doesn't do a bad job. And in fact, the basic idea is that if I were to really, think of a neural network, and again, let's not go into the details of any one of these things. It turns out that if I can, retrain my neural network with those approximations, the hardware level approximations, I can still get a reasonable accuracy. Probably I don't even lose my accuracy much. So why not do it that way? And if I do that, it turns out, I can just show you some results where this is actually an approximate multiplication that I ended up doing. Okay? I didn't really do the exact multiplication, ended up doing approximate multiplication, and I trained my neural network with those approximate circuits, and it turns out it actually ends up doing reasonably well. I don't really have much of an accuracy degradation, but I get almost 30 to 40% improvement in energy consumption. Why am I getting this improvement in energy consumption? Because my hardware is less complex. Because of those approximations that I made. So now, you might say, something? You talked about the fact that you can do these multiplications approximately, but you said hardware energy consumption is dominated by the memory. So can I do approximations? The memory itself. And it turns out there are also possibilities of making approximations in your memory, different kinds of approximation, and these are the hardware level approximations that I'm talking about. And it turns out, again, by properly approximating the memory, I can actually get improvement in energy consumption. Okay. You might also say, hey, are there other kinds of approximations possible? Certainly, you can actually get rid of connections in your network, and those are called pruning. By actually getting rid of some of those connections in some ways, it shouldn't really be random. It has to have a methodology to that madness rather than just doing random. And if I do that properly, it turns out you can get rid of a lot of connections from the network, and you can get a much sparser network along with those other approximations, and you can get a good amount of improvement in energy consumption. Can you do other things? Yeah. I talked about so many times compute in memory. When you do the computations in memory in interesting ways, and I can tell you that, hey, something? This was my neural network, the basic computation unit, and I needed to do these inputs which are coming in, multiplied with the weights, and I needed to do addition. Very simple computation I need to do. Can I do it in a very, very simple way rather than going to the memory, fetching the data, coming back from the memory, and so on? Hey, is it possible that I have some devices which can be programmed to have different conductance or resistance? Okay? Or in other words, anybody heard of memristors? Okay? If not, that's fine. But one can potentially think of having, let's say, a crossbar kind of structure like this, where at the cross point of it, one can put a device which can be programmed to have a particular resistance. Okay? So if I'm able to have a programmed resistance right here in an array like this, what does it tell you? I have certain input that comes in, and if the input is a voltage, and this is, by the way, Ohm's law, Kirchhoff's law, so nothing more than that. If I have an input voltage that comes in right here, if this is V1, this is V2, this is V3, and if W's are the conductances, okay, what am I going to get here? Summation of Vi times Wi. And if Wi is conductance, what am I going to get here? Is a total current. Right? I am doing that summation of Vi Wi just like this weighted summation that I'm doing here. I don't have to go to the memory. I basically say, hey, I have these devices which are memory devices right here, and I do the computation which is multiplication. It's an analog computation, multiplication, addition directly into my memory unit right here. Okay? That would be compute in memory. I don't have to go and fetch data from the memory. Okay, I can do the computation in the memory itself directly. And that's quite useful. So there are different kinds of devices. Remember I talked about a magnetic device earlier? That can be placed right here. Can I do something else? How about the thresholding function? I showed earlier that the neurons, if you need to do that with a CMOS technology, you need several devices. But it turns out, again, some of these magnetic devices can directly mimic this operation. This may not be the best operation that I talked about. This is like a perceptron kind of, hard thresholding I, mentioned. That may not be the best. It turns out that you can do something which is a little bit different, which is like a sigmoid function. And the sigmoid can also be done using these devices. So I talked about, computation in the memory itself. And if I were to really now implement a neural network, I'm going to have a crossbar like this, which is going to do the weighted summation operation. And I need a neuron right here, which can be one of these devices, and which can implement, let's say, this functionality. And now I'm going to not go into any details, but let you know that, hey, you know something? This particular functionality, which is like a sigmoid function, I can actually have a stochastic sigmoid function. So what do I mean by a stochastic sigmoid function? If I have an input current that comes in, which is like the current here, if the current is here, I actually get a certain output from the sigmoid. And if I translate that into saying that when I have this input right here, that is related to a particular value of the probability that the device switches. So this is actually a curve which I can represent in terms of a probability of switching. Okay? If I do that, turns out that these neurons can still work with a probability of switching here, a device which can stochastically switch, and I can have a network which looks somewhat like this, where I have these crossbars doing summation of VIGIs, and I have a neuron which has this sigmoid function, but a stochastic sigmoid, meaning thereby it has a stochastic switching function. It's easy to implement in my devices, and if I do that, I can still get a network which is actually quite good, and it's called the stochastic spiking neural network. Okay? In fact, I can potentially think of having each of those devices to be stochastic in nature, so that every device that you can potentially think of has a stochastic switching behavior and stochastically switching. Think about it. I have all these random devices that one can think of. I put all these random devices. Random meaning it's not quite random. It has a probability of switching. It's a weighted probability of switching. And if I'm able to do that in all these devices right here, the same device, actually I can get a neural network, which actually works well. Okay? So all devices to be stochastic in nature. I'm not going into the details of it. If anybody is interested, one can do that, but hey, that's possible. Everything has a stochastic switching behavior. You might think, how does it work? Is there a theory behind it? In all these switching activities and switching. It turns out that you can do all kinds of interesting things. I talked about a neuromorphic computing, which is neural networks. One can actually do combinatorial optimization using the same kind of network. Using these devices, I said, hey, this is my stochastic device. Every, element in this network is going to be stochastic in nature, and they get inputs from their neighbors, and based on their input conditions, inputs are not stochastic, based on the input conditions, and I have a stochastic switching behavior, one can show that you can do different kinds of optimizations, random walks, Bayesian inferencing, and so on. Okay, so anybody heard of traveling salesman problem? Yeah? Okay, so basic idea in a traveling salesman problem is that you have, let's say, hundreds of cities, and the traveling salesman has to start from city 1 and has to visit all the cities without visiting the same city twice. So what would be an optimum way of doing that? Because all cities are at different distance from each other, right? So what's the best way to do that? By the way, you might think the problem is a simple problem, but if I tell you it's not 100 cities, it's 200 cities, it becomes an enormously complex problem. And it can take you a long time to solve. okay? And you may not really be able to come up with a solution which is an optimum solution. It might take you a long time. So those are some of the combinatorial optimization problems, and it turns out that some of these neural networks that I talked about, and I didn't really talk about any particular type of neural network, but there are ones which are called the Boltzmann machines, and you can use those Boltzmann machines, and which basically would really have these to be the different inputs, rather different nodes of the network, which can either be up or down or at 0 or 1, and you can have data coming from the near neighbors. And if you can formulate the problem well, these are all stochastic switching behaviors that can take you out of local minimas. Sometimes you can get stuck in a local minima, meaning thereby if you really look at the space for optimization space, if you are here, you might think that it is a minima, but it's not quite this is a local minima, but this is the real minima that you're really interested in. And you can get stuck here because if you go this way, you say, hey, the cost increases. If you go this way, the cost increases. In order to have the cost decrease, you got to get out of here. And the only way that you can sometimes get out of there is to take moves or actually have a stochastic switching behavior, which can take you out of that. And these kind of like optimizations, things like that can take you out of the local minima into a global minima and can potentially do different kinds of optimizations. So what I'm really talking about is that some of these networks can not only be useful for the kind of recognition problems that I'm talking about, but can potentially be used for other kinds of optimizations using this stochastic behavior. But in conclusion, what I really wanted to say is that, since you guys are all undergrad students, if you do end up going for graduate studies, or for example, if you end up taking a job, there's plenty of research opportunities at the different levels of abstraction. So there's a plenty of room, not just at the bottom, but also at the top. Okay? So there's plenty of room at the bottom and the top. Neural algorithms, architecture, devices, all those are different areas that one can potentially work on. Energy efficiency certainly is going to be critical. And, some things that I didn't really talk about is the fact that you need to sometimes know why things work and why things don't work. Okay? And so there has to be some theoretical analysis of some of these computing models that need to be done. That's all I have, but I thought that I'll just let you know that, some of the work that I just talked about is being done as a part of the Center for Brain-Inspired Computing. It's actually a center which is at $36 million over 5 years, and there are several universities involved in it, and where we're looking at different kinds of algorithms, the hardware fabrics, something like distributed intelligence, which I didn't really talk about, having a swarm of drones, for example, where they're flying and they need to have some collective intelligence. Application drivers are going to be really self-flying drones and personal robotic assistants. And this is actually a program which is funded by Department of Defense, which is DARPA, the TSMC, IBM, Intel, Analog Devices, Samsung, and so on, Raytheon. And finally, the universities that produce the lead. So I'm the director of the center, and there are several other universities involved here, and there are 19 faculty involved in that research program. All right, so that's all I have. And thank you very much. I hope I didn't bore you too much. Any questions? Yeah.
What form is your training data usually take?
Pardon me?
Your training data, because I know you talked about it a little bit.
Yeah.
But what sort of training data?
What kind of data sets that we used? For some of these, simpler problems that I was showing, basically we've been using the MNIST and the CFAR, but more recently we have these other ones that we've been looking at, ImageNet, CFAR 100, and so on. If there are no other questions, I always feel that, I take it the other, either you didn't understand anything, which is possible, or you understood everything, and I'm going to assume that you did. All right, thank you.